In the spring of 1848, somewhere on the frozen coast of a place the maps had not yet named, a line of men walked out onto the ice to die. There were more than 100 of them, officers and sailors of the finest navy in the world, dragging boats mounted on sledges across a landscape with no horizon, no trees, no shelter, no sun for months at a time. Behind them, trapped in the pack ice, were the two ships that had carried them to the top of the world. Ahead of them was nothing. They had sailed from England 3 years earlier to a send-off fit for heroes. 2 ships, 129 men, the best-equipped Arctic expedition ever assembled, commanded by a knight of the realm, sent to conquer the last blank space on the map. Not one of them came home. And when, years later, a Scottish explorer finally returned to London with the truth of what had happened to them, a truth he had learned from the Inuit, the people who actually lived in that impossible place, England did not thank him. England called him a liar and sent its most beloved storyteller to destroy him. This is Creepy History. I'm Shane Cohen. To understand why this story broke the British Empire's heart, you have to understand the obsession behind it. The Northwest Passage. For centuries, European powers had dreamed of a sea route across the top of North America, a shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific that would open the riches of Asia to whoever controlled it. Ship after ship had gone looking for it. Many never returned. By the 1840s, the passage had become something more than a trade route. It was a matter of national pride. The one prize the greatest navy on earth had never quite been able to claim. In 1845, the British Admiralty decided to finish the job. They chose 2 ships that had already proven themselves in the ice at the other end of the world, in Antarctica. Their names could not have been more fitting for the story to come. HMS Erebus, named for the Greek personification of darkness, the shadow between Earth and the underworld, and HMS Terror. These were not ordinary vessels. They were bomb ships, built to absorb the recoil of enormous mortars, which made their hulls extraordinarily strong. For the Arctic, they were reinforced further. Iron plating on the bows, crossbeams of oak and iron. And they were fitted with something genuinely new, steam engines repurposed from locomotives that could drive the ships through gaps in the ice when the wind failed, and heating systems to keep the crew alive through the polar winter. They were provisioned for 3 years, and the manifest reads like the confidence of the age itself. Tens of thousands of pounds of flour and salted meat, thousands of gallons of concentrated spirits, and thousands of tins of preserved food, meat, soup, vegetables, because canning was a brand new technology, and the Admiralty believed it had solved the ancient problem of feeding men through an Arctic winter. That belief may have been one of the things that killed them, but we'll come back to that. And it wasn't only food. The ships carried a library of more than 1,000 books, writing desks and quill pens for the officers, fine china plates, cut glass wine goblets, silver cutlery engraved with each officer's family crest. There was a hand organ that could play 50 tunes. There were the men's dress uniforms, their buttons polished, ready for the ceremonial return they all assumed was coming. Think about that. They packed for a homecoming. They brought the silver and the crystal and the sheet music, because in their minds, this was not a gamble. It was a procession. The Victorians were not just sending an expedition into the unknown. They were sending a floating piece of England, its class system, its comforts, its absolute certainty, confident it would carve straight through the ice and out the other side into history. Almost every object on that list would later be found scattered across the ice or resting on the seafloor or traded through Inuit hands for generations. The crystal did not save them. The silver did not save them. In the end, the thing that might have saved them was the knowledge of the people whose land they were dying on. And that was the one thing they had not thought to bring. To lead it, they chose Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old, considered old for such a command, and he was not the Admiralty's first choice. but he was experienced, respected, and he wanted it badly. He'd been to the Arctic before on overland expeditions, one of which had gone so disastrously that he'd earned a grim nickname, the man who ate his boots, from a journey where his party had been reduced to eating lichen and leather to survive. Remember that detail. It will echo. On the 19th of May, 1845, Erebus and Terror sailed from Greenhithe, England. 129 men aboard. Crowds waved them off. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, a formidable, brilliant, socially connected woman who will matter enormously to this story, watched her husband leave for the top of the world. In late July 1845, a whaling ship called the Enterprise encountered the expedition in Baffin Bay off the coast of Greenland. The two ships were moored to an iceberg, waiting for conditions to let them push west into the passage. The whalers exchanged greetings. Then they sailed on and watched Erebus and Terror grow smaller against the ice. They were the last Europeans to ever see any of those 129 men alive. At first, no one worried. This was expected. An Arctic expedition disappeared into the ice for a year, 2 years, sometimes 3. That was normal. There was no way to send word home. You simply waited. But by 1847, 2 years on, the silence had begun to feel different. And here the story acquires its second central figure, not an explorer, but a wife. Lady Jane Franklin refused to accept that her husband was simply gone. She began, almost single-handedly, to move the machinery of an empire. She wrote letters to the Admiralty, to the government, to the President of the United States. She funded search expeditions out of her own money when the Navy dragged its feet. She offered rewards. She became, in the public imagination, the grieving heroine waiting at the edge of the world, and she turned that image into a force that launched more than 30 search expeditions over the following years. Think about that number. The search for Franklin became one of the largest rescue efforts in history to that point. At the height of it, in 1850, more than a dozen ships were coaling the Arctic at once, from both the Atlantic and Pacific sides. The British public followed it the way later generations would follow a moon landing or a missing airliner, obsessively, emotionally, desperate for word. The United States joined in. Private citizens funded voyages, newspapers printed every scrap of rumor. And in a bitter irony, those search expeditions accomplished the very thing Franklin had set out to do. Crisscrossing the Arctic in search of 2 lost ships, they charted thousands of miles of unknown coastline, filling in the blank spaces on the map that Franklin had died trying to complete. He failed to find the passage. The Armada, looking for his bones, effectively finished the job for him. The map of the top of the world was drawn, in the end, by grief. But for years, for all those ships and all that money, they found almost nothing. The Arctic is staggeringly vast, and it does not give up its dead easily. 129 men and 2 full-sized ships had gone into it, and it was as if the ice had simply closed its hand around them. The first real clue came in 1850 on a tiny scrap of land called Beechey Island. A search party found the expedition's first winter camp and 3 graves, 3 headboards carved carefully with 3 names, 3 ages, 3 dates. John Torrington, 20. John Hartnell, 25. William Brain, 32. 3 young men who had died in that first winter of 1845 into 1846 and been buried with full naval ceremony in ground so frozen their crewmates would have had to hack the graves out of it. The headboards even carried Bible verses. The graves were neat, deliberate, dignified. Whoever buried these men still had discipline, still had hope, still fully believed they were all going home. More than a century later, in the 1980s, scientists would return to Beechey Island and, with permission, exhume those 3 bodies from the permafrost that had preserved them almost perfectly. Their faces still recognizable, their eyes still open, after nearly 140 years. It is one of the most haunting images in the history of exploration. A young sailor's face, frozen in time, staring up at the researchers who had come to ask him how he died. And there was something wrong with the answer. These 3 men had died early, far too early. young, screened for health before they sailed, dead within months. Tissue analysis would later reveal extraordinarily high levels of lead in their bodies. Something aboard those ships was already poisoning the crew before the expedition had truly even begun. The disaster didn't start on the long walk across the ice. It started quietly in that first dark winter, and the men had no idea. And then, past Beechey Island, the trail went cold again. The ships had sailed on into the ice, and the ice had closed behind them. For nearly a decade, that was all anyone knew. 3 graves on a frozen island, and 126 men who had simply vanished off the edge of the map. In 1854, 9 years after the ship sailed, the truth finally arrived in London, and England could not bear it. The man who brought it was named Dr. John Ray, and he was in almost every way the opposite of Sir John Franklin. Ray was a Scotsman from the Orkney Islands, a surgeon and surveyor employed not by the Royal Navy, but by the Hudson's Bay Company, the fur trading enterprise. He was one of the greatest Arctic travelers who ever lived, and the reason was simple. Unlike the Navy men who dragged England with them into the ice and died doing it, Ray had learned from the Inuit. He traveled light, he built snow shelters, he ate what the land provided, he wore fur. He learned their techniques for surviving a place that killed almost everyone else. To much of proper Victorian society, this made him slightly suspect, a man who had gone native. In the spring of 1854, on the Boothia Peninsula, Ray met an Inuk hunter carrying a gold cap band from a Royal Navy officer's uniform. And when Ray asked where it had come from, the man told him a story. Years earlier, other Inuit had encountered a party of around 40 white men, gaunt and starving, dragging a boat and sledges south across the ice near a place called Back River. The men could barely speak. Through gestures, they made it understood that their ships had been crushed and that they were walking desperately toward the mainland in search of food. Later that same season, the Inuit had found their bodies, around 35 of them scattered across the ice and the shore, some in a tent, some under an overturned boat, some simply fallen where they walked. And from the state of the corpses, Ray recorded this carefully because it was the most terrible part. It was clear that in their final extremity, the last survivors had turned to the only thing left that could prolong their lives. They had eaten their dead. The Inuit showed Ray the proof: silver forks and spoons engraved with the crests of Franklin's officers, a small silver plate bearing Sir John Franklin's own name. These were not rumors. These were the possessions of specific, named men, carried back from the place where they died. Ray understood immediately what he had. This was not vague rumor. The relics were physical, specific, and traceable to named officers. The account came from people who had no reason to invent it and every detail of survival to know that country better than any Englishman alive. To Ray, who had spent years learning to trust Inuit knowledge because that knowledge had kept him alive, there was no question of dismissing it. He also, being a fundamentally honest man, understood his duty. He could have written a sanitized report. He could have left out the single most explosive detail and spared himself everything that was about to happen to him. He knew, he must have known, that the word cannibalism attached to British naval heroes would detonate like a bomb. He wrote it anyway, all of it. The starvation, the desperate march, the scattered bodies, and the terrible evidence of what the last men had done to survive. He recorded it plainly and sent it to the Admiralty, along with the truth he considered just as important, that the Inuit had not harmed these men. They had found them already dead, and some Inuit had even given the starving sailors what little food they could spare before the end. And then the report was leaked to the press. The confidential document meant for the Admiralty's eyes appeared in the newspapers, and the single word every editor seized upon was cannibalism. Ray's careful, compassionate account was flattened into a headline designed to horrify. Within days, the entire British public knew that the Great Franklin expedition had, in the words now racing across the country, ended in an act too monstrous to name. And the nation decided almost instantly who to blame. not the ice, not the Admiralty. The messenger. The reaction was not grief. It was fury. And it was aimed not at the Arctic, not at the Admiralty that had sent old men and iron ships to their deaths, but at John Ray for daring to repeat what the Inuit had said. The idea was, to the Victorian mind, simply impossible. These were British naval officers, Christian gentlemen, heroes. The notion that such men could be reduced to eating one another was an obscenity, not a tragedy to be mourned, but a slander to be denied. And the loudest voice demanding that denial belonged to Lady Jane Franklin. She had spent nearly a decade building her husband into a national saint. She was not about to let a fur trader from Orkney turn him into a horror story. And so she reached for the most powerful weapon in Victorian England. She reached for Charles Dickens. Dickens, the most famous and beloved writer in the world, took up Lady Franklin's cause with enthusiasm. In his own widely read magazine, Household Words, he published a lengthy attack, not really on Ray himself, but on his sources, on the Inuit. Dickens argued that the testimony of the Inuit was worthless, that they were, in his words, a race of savages, covetous, treacherous, and cruel. He suggested that the noble British sailors would never have committed such an act, and floated, without a shred of evidence, a far more comfortable theory, that if there had been any mutilation of the bodies, it was surely the Inuit themselves who had done it. The savages had murdered the survivors, he implied, and were now lying about it. Sit with what happened here. The people who had actually been there, who knew that country, who had found the bodies and even tried to help some of the dying men, those people were called liars and murderers. And the man who had faithfully carried their account home was publicly discredited by the most respected storyteller of the age on behalf of a grieving widow who preferred a beautiful lie to an unbearable truth. It worked. Ray was denied the honors he'd earned, though he had, on that same journey, discovered the final navigable link of the Northwest Passage itself. He was quietly written out of the story. He never received the recognition given to lesser men. He had committed the one unforgivable Victorian sin. He had told the truth, and the truth was ugly, and he had believed the wrong people when he did it. John Ray died in 1893, still largely unhonored. It would take another 120 years and a plaque in Westminster Abbey placed in 2014 for England to finally admit he'd been right all along. Because he was right. About all of it. In 1859, 5 years after Ray, a search expedition, funded of course by Lady Franklin, finally reached King William Island, at the heart of where the men had died. And there, tucked inside a stone cairn, they found the only written record ever recovered from the entire expedition. It is a single sheet of Admiralty paper, and it tells the story in 2 layers, like a wound. The first message, written in 1847, is scrawled in the margins, and it is almost cheerful. All well. The ships wintered in the ice, a sledge party was out exploring, everything proceeding as planned. Around the edges of that same page, written a year later in 1848, is the second message. Different handwriting, different world. It reports that Erebus and Terror had been trapped in the ice for a year and a half, that the surviving officers and crew, now numbering 105, had abandoned the ships 3 days earlier, and in a line that lands like a stone, that Sir John Franklin had died on the 11th of June, 1847. He never even saw the worst of it. He died aboard his ship before the long walk began. The survivors signed the note and set out for the mainland, dragging their boats. We know now where that walk led. It led to the scattered bodies the Inuit described. It led to Back River. It led nowhere. For the next century and a half, searchers and scientists slowly filled in the horror. Skeletons found along the route. And when modern forensic teams examined the bones, they confirmed, piece by piece, everything Victorian England had refused to believe. The men had suffered from scurvy, from starvation, from lead poisoning, possibly from the very tin cans that were supposed to keep them alive, or from the ship's water systems, a slow contamination that may have clouded their judgment and weakened their bodies in that first deadly winter. That's likely why 3 young men died so early on Beechey Island. And the cannibalism. The bones told that story too, unmistakably. Cut marks, breaks consistent with the extraction of marrow, the desperate work of dying men trying to live one more day. In 2024, 170 years after Ray's report, DNA and forensic analysis identified one particular jawbone as belonging to Captain James Fitzjames, a senior officer of the Erebus. His remains bore cut marks, which means that in the end, on that ice, rank and honor and Englishness meant nothing at all. The captain was consumed like anyone else. But the final vindication belonged to the Inuit. For decades, their oral histories had been dismissed as the chatter of savages, stories passed down through generations telling exactly where the ships had gone. One had sunk in deep water to the north. One had drifted south and settled in shallow water near a place they named. Its masts, they said, had stood above the surface for a time, and Inuit had boarded it. 20th century researchers finally did what Dickens never would. They listened. They took the Inuit accounts seriously, plotted them, and searched exactly where the stories said to look. In September 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was found in shallow southern water precisely where Inuit testimony had placed it for over a century. In September 2016, HMS Terror was found in a bay that already, by grim coincidence, bore its name, Terror Bay. And it was almost perfectly preserved. Divers and remote cameras sent down into the wreck found something close to a ghost ship frozen in time. Plates still stacked on shelves, bottles still standing upright, a cabin's contents largely undisturbed under the cold, dark water. Windows intact, the wheel still in place. A ship that had been missing for 170 years, sitting quietly on the seafloor as though its crew had just stepped away. That preservation is a gift to archaeology, and the work continues to this day. Parks Canada, in partnership with Inuit communities, slowly recovering artifacts and, they hope, one day answers to the questions the Victory Point note left open. Somewhere in those 2 hulls may be the expedition's records, its logbooks, even daguerreotype photographs, the frozen dark potentially holding the men's own account of their final years. But the location itself was the real revelation. Both ships were found not where the Royal Navy's grand search had concentrated, but in the southern waters the Inuit had pointed to all along. One sunk in deeper water to the north, one drifted south to the shallows, its masts once visible above the surface, boarded by Inuit who described it in detail, a ship full of goods and, in one account, the body of one very large man left aboard. Both ships, exactly where the people England called liars, had always said they were. 129 men sailed into the ice, certain that the greatest empire on earth had made them unstoppable. What actually kept the truth of their fate alive was not the admiralty, not the medals, not the monuments. It was the memory of the Inuit, carried by voice, generation to generation, through the same Arctic that swallowed the men who wouldn't listen to them. England sent iron ships and a knight and 1,000 books, and the ice took all of it. The people who survived that place were the ones who'd been telling the truth the whole time. If this one moved you, please subscribe for more creepy history.